All right, well, it looks like people are starting to filter in, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Powering Inclusion Summit. This Activator Lab is focused on building back Black wealth block by block. We've got D'Angelos and Wyking here, and I will open the floor for each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us what organization you're with and give us a little input on the work that you do.
Absolutely. I'll kick us off. Thank you, Genesis, for hosting this session, but also to the Center for Economic Inclusion and the entire team for putting on what has been a powerful week for me, and I know many others feel the same way. My name is D'Angelos Svenkeson. I recognize several of the names and the attendees thus far, so hello, friends. But I'm based here in the Twin Cities, born and raised in St. Paul. I lead a urban planning and real estate development consulting firm called NEOO Partners, where we focus on small to medium-sized businesses and local government, including nonprofit sector leaders. And so our work is really around how do we bring the technical expertise that's typically not available to small businesses because of they don't have the scale to draw the macro market players to really serve them correctly or thoroughly. So we like to bring that level of expertise to the ground level, particularly focused in Minneapolis and St. Paul proper in the urban core.
Great. So I guess that puts it on. That's on me. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Good to be here. Thank you for CI for the invitation and everyone who showed up. I hope that we can learn and share some insights about very important work that is happening and needs to happen across, our various cities and communities. My name is Wyking Garrett. I'm currently president and CEO of Africatown Community Land Trust in Seattle, Washington. I'm a native of the Central District Africatown community in Seattle. My background is in primarily youth and community development, which as we faced a significant amount of displacement in our the community that Blacks have called home in Seattle for almost 140 years, really just took action with other community stakeholders to form the land trust as a viable solution for land acquisition, stewardship, and development to facilitate the Black community to be able to grow and thrive in place and be a part of the future of Seattle. So far, we've been involved in one large development, 115 unit over commercial space, and which opened last year. And we're working on our second large scale project, about 130 units over commercial space across the street from that project. And our focus is really around permanent affordability. We started with rental, multifamily rental. We're also now working on affordable home ownership project as well. And also understanding that buildings don't build community, people build community. So making sure that the work that we are doing is building capacity, building with community, and not building for our communities. And so excited to be here and looking forward to learning more and sharing whatever insights from our journey that we can offer.
All right, and I see we have our final panelist that was able to join us here as well today. Could you introduce yourself? Oh, you're on mute.
Hi, my name is Nneka Constantino. I am a wealth manager at Merrill Lynch. So I manage a portfolio of about 70 million in client assets for ultra high net worth individuals. And then outside of that, my husband and I own the commercial real estate that holds his retail businesses. He owns furniture stores. So we're commercial real estate partners. And outside of that, my W-2 income comes from managing high net worth client assets at Merrill Lynch. And then in addition to that, I host the financial fitness radio program here in Minnesota on 89.9 KMOJ. And so I'm very passionate about building Black wealth, right? And I'm happy to be in the right panel room. I was in the wrong one. So apologies.
We're glad to have you here. I guess I'll open the floor with the first question. How do we hold institutions, that's bank, city, private investors, accountable to ensure that people have opportunities for ownership within their own communities? DeAngelis, I guess I'll start with you.
I was hoping Nneka started with.
I can.
Go ahead.
I was like, I can. Well, the first part of that was how do we hold banks accountable? And I think one of the ways that we need to hold banks accountable is through the Community Reinvestment Act and really demanding that they work with businesses and are lending to Black people. And a lot of times, you know, we're starting to use the term Black and brown, we're starting to use the term biopic, and all of these are terms to me that are great, but systemically exclude descendants of slaves. And so when we look at businesses on the north side, and I say the north side of Minnesota, but we're talking about these gentrified communities that are historically African-American communities that are throughout the country. So they have the Community Reinvestment Act. They have grant giving, fundraising initiatives. They have SBA lenders. But when we look at the programs like PPP, when we look at the SBA, are we really holding them accountable to say who is an SBA lender in the hood? Right. And so that's how we hold banks accountable, is we start business by business doing that. We also hold these places accountable by being real in our roles, right? Because a lot of times we'll have Black executives that work at the top banks across the country, or the top companies, or sit on boards, or in positions of power, and people will be afraid to advocate, right? And that's exactly what you are supposed to do in that seat. You are supposed to advocate. And so when we sit on these boards and when we sit in these positions of power, and we're not advocating for the descendants of slaves, we're not advocating for other business owners that represent our community, we are absolutely doing a disservice to our constituents. And my constituents are African-American people, business owners who look like me, right? We have across the country pockets of community where we're at consistently double-digit employment, twice the average for the white population. And when we see these statistics and when we see these gross disparities, we have no problem having a conversation, but we really need to spearhead moving beyond the conversation to capital investment, venture capitalism, and investment in Black businesses, right? We can have all the conversations in the world, but if we still have individual business owners who are not receiving venture capitalism, if we still have business owners that have to do grassroots initiatives in order to develop capital, then all of us are doing a disservice, and we have to take personal inventory on what we are doing to promote advocacy. And so if you're not in a position of power, if you're not with one of these banks, if you can't go in and ask for a CRA file, if you can't talk about venture capitalism, then where you can start your advocacy is by doing business with Black people, doing business with descendants of slaves. That's how you can move the needle. And that's kind of what is required for us to get from A to Z and move the comma to the left in the Black community.
And I'll open the floor to the others. I mean, I know you guys are on the other side of the spectrum, on the development side, you're in the communities. Do you have any thoughts or additions to what Nneka said?
I would, I mean, what she said was, very powerful and spot on. I would also just add that it's important to define the role of a bank. What is this financial institution, supposed to do in a community? We do need to be clear. I think that banks hold wealth that is derived from much of the sweat equity that Africans who were brought to America were forced to invest into the American enterprise, right? And that wealth has been passed over generations. It, went from agriculture to financing industrial economy, and now, it's still financing. It's never went away, right? And so that's one thing, we have to be clear about the fact that we do have, a sweat equity investment in this enterprise, which we're not able to access our capital. We were the capital that activated the land capital, the land that was taken from the indigenous people. So just being clear about circumstances, being clear about the role that, banks in collusion with, federal and other, pretty much all levels of government have played in denying access to capital, and we understand that capital is really the lifeblood of communities in the, society that we live in, right? And so understanding that there has been an active role in creating the conditions where we are under-resourced and under-capitalized. And then, so, again, we're not seeking charity, and so I think, understanding what our relationships to these institutions have been, are now, and should be in order, if they're, in equitable circumstances. Being clear about how the banks, whether through CRA and different mechanisms, can be part of the solution, right? Invite them, challenge them to be part of the solution, and then have measurable, what are the KPIs? What are the key performance indicators? For us, our evaluation and management of relationships is really related. When we talk about equity, we look at equity as ownership, right? And we look at, how much do we own? How much are we accessing? How are the dollars, how's the pie being divided? How much square feet, is under our communities, again, ownership and control, right? And so we can be very clear about a scorecard when we're using numbers and not using, as was said, discussions, the number of discussions, the number of speakers brought in, the number of announcements about diversity and inclusion initiatives, but really looking at the key metrics. And I think that's important for the community to be aware of, our communities to be aware of. We also have to be clear about the power of our dollar and the power of our presence, right? So how do we collectively leverage, where we place our funds, what institutions we place our funds in, the institutions that are in our communities, and, pull up those CRAs and make that a normal thing that we review those in our community. And if it's not, if the numbers that we're seeing are not acceptable, then, I like the model that the Nneka used in Boston. They pulled up, and demanded accountability wherever they needed to show up, and so I think in the digital era, we have a lot more tools to expose truths in terms of holding people accountable. But I think, we do need to be present, and, it does also start with us being aware of the power of our own dollars, because banks, financial institutions are also, in competition, right? And they understand the power of a dollar as well. So I think those are a few things that I think that we can, a few ways that we can look at holding financial institutions in our community accountable for how they show up and the effects they have on our community.
I think that's powerful with the two of them added. And so I'm not going to belabor, but I will say, like, the reality is accountability is a little convoluted in community settings, because it's really, if we're honest, accountability is an inside job. I mean, the leadership, the teams at these organizations have to hold themselves accountable to doing the right thing. And so I'm going to say that, and I'm going to move on to what can we do from the outside looking in. And I would say that organizations do not feel pressure. People feel pressure. They feel pressure based on their jobs. They feel pressure based on their reputations. And so how can we, from the outside, ensure the people at these organizations that we have built either relationship with, or we have seen their track record through CRA or other foundation giving documents, what their track record is in our communities and giving. And I would say that we have to focus on, I would say, 3 areas. One, CRA is a part of it, the regulation. But I think, the work that Congressman Waters and Congressman Beatty are doing around the diversity and inclusion of holding large financial institutions accountable. They've asked for data from these groups. How can we hold them accountable in a very digital age, where we can look at the data and say who's doing what and who's not doing what? And so I think regulation is one part in which we need to continue to push for as a community and as people, so these organizations can toe the line if the leadership isn't prepared to do it on day one. The second thing is that, to the point that Wyking made about where we put our money, consumer behavior. This is one thing that we can directly control that has an immediate impact on organizations and how they feel on a day-to-day basis. This is, again, putting the pressure on the people, not on some monolithic organization that doesn't really exist aside from paper. It's the people there who have their jobs, their reputations to uphold, and they want to see those dollars and those figures behind their promotion, behind their raise, behind their moral standing in community. The third is that these monoliths of organizations, the only thing they really have of value aside from their talent is their brand and their reputation. As a community, when we are loud about our advocacy, when we are loud about the injustices and the miscomings of their either CRA or their track record of predatory lending, their track record of denying or foreclosing on Black properties, we impede on that brand and reputation's ability to penetrate our market and thus influencing consumer behavior. And so I think there's some loud and there's some quiet portions of accountability, and of course, accountability is an inside job. But from the outside looking in, these are really the tools we have, right? We have regulation, we have our own personal choice in our behavior, and we, with our personal choice, can be loud and influencing the brand and reputation. I think that gets the attention of the people at these organizations. It puts the pressure back on them and not some mythical, name on the side of the road. It's like, no, this is CEO XYZ, this is the VP XYZ that isn't living up to the standards that we have set as a society to do the right thing in communities, especially when we're talking about Black communities.
I have one more thing to add too, is when we look at African-American businesses in development, we have a particular issue in the community where access to capital, particularly loans between $50,000 and $350,000, are very hard to access. And it's important to have this conversation because we're talking about development, we're talking about economic development, right? Increasing the tax base in a particular community, right? And bringing jobs. And we have African-American businesses that aren't able to access capital when rates are at near historic lows. We also are dealing with some of the same banks that have insured slavery and have not been able to figure out a way to spearhead this growth in African-American communities. We have to get beyond the micro lending conversation as well. That's important and that has its place. But when we're talking about the type of development that moves communities and raises the tax base, we're talking about lending at a different level and access to a different level of capital. And we're looking at an organization like the SBA that says by their own admission that they are down 47%. They were down 47% in African-American lending from 2009 to 2013. We haven't seen the numbers of where they've been recently, but this is something that we have to deal with in our community at a historic level. Why aren't there many organizations that are doing direct SBA lending in Black communities to Black businesses and unable to kind of unpack the skills and resources required to take someone from a micro loan to a loan of significance, which has the ability to multiply and create generational wealth. We have to move the conversation from this grassroots, very small level where we have all of these nonprofit organizations. And, if you're part of one of these nonprofit organizations or part of one of these institutions, it's absolutely no shade to you, but I find it to be quite interesting that we have all of these organizations that receive grant dollars and funding to work with African Americans. Then they turn around, give these African Americans these very small micro loans. And then when you talk to those same executives and organizations as it relates to procurement, they move D&I from the conversation. Now, all of a sudden, we're not talking to African-American businesses. Now, when it's comes to the point to do some actual development in your business, you're not looking for a minority contractor. You've taken D&I to a very micro view, and you're not applying it on a macro level in all ways that you do business, right? You do an RFP for name your request for proposal, and now African Americans have to scrape for a seat at the table. And that kind of mentality is the mentality that we all have to call out, regardless what organizations we sit in and where we have our influence.
Great point. I would also just like to add, we should be looking at also how we leverage technology, fintech, looking at, innovative, solutions that can disrupt the status quo. How do we look at alternatives to traditional, banking institutions, credit unions, CDFIs in the age of technology, right? And so I think there are more ways that we can look at how our capital flows within our own communities, and then how we bring other capital into the community using technology, how we have different ways of, credit, dealing with credit, barriers, building on the experience of, micro lending, throughout the globe to, come up with new solutions that work for us in our current circumstances in our communities. I think that's a big opportunity. As we've seen, the Airbnbs, the Uber, we've seen so much disruption. We see crowdfunding actually, happening and working, but, how do we tweak GoFundMes and Kickstarters and things like that to be more systematic solutions, that are part of the community?
Yeah, I like that. And it speaks to like what we always have done, right, in Black communities. We've always created alternatives to the system in order for us to get to where we are after 400 years of basic hell until we got to a point where we could at least vote and do all these other things. And so how do we, I like alternative systems, right?
We look into the Jobs Act, and how that, created, the opportunity for equity investment, to non-accredited investors, has that saturated our community, really, right? And so, yeah.
Yeah, and so I love them. And it also reminds me, though, of what Nneka said earlier about the alternative can only be so much of the pie right now, just because the math numbers are skewed against us for crowdsourcing ourselves, right? We need existing institutions. If we look at the financial ecosystem and just using finance as a proxy for the conversation, I think in our communities we have a lot of alternative ways to bring money together. We figure that part out. What we don't have is our own institutional ways of bringing money together. And this is back to the point of venture capital, of private equity, of hedge, of wealth management organizations, that we bring capital together in much larger scale ways so that impact can be transformative across individual projects or individual programs, but be just a way of life. I mean, there's some cities who are more advanced and their ecosystem is a little more built out with African-American controlled large capital organizations, New York and DC and Atlanta. But there aren't that many when you look at the breadth of the country and the breadth of the 40 million African Americans when you talk about the need. And so I think it's an and all. I don't like to say both and, I like an and all. Like, we need this alternative system to advance with the technology, to your point, but we need organizations, especially those who have leadership, who are willing to do the right thing. I mean, this is about just doing the right thing in the moment and transforming evil historical legacies of trauma, of disinvestment, of gentrification with capital that you have access to that you can't spend in your current circles, because we're looking at population and demographic changes. We're looking at this country becoming blacker and browner. The future of growth is us. The future of growth is us and our brothers and sisters who are Latinx and Native. You have to invest in us. Or the other portion of holding them accountable is letting them fail. Because eventually, just like in college football, the University of Minnesota won its national championships because they were one of the first to welcome African-American players on the team when the South wouldn't. The South changed its perspectives after the North began winning championships. And I think the ecosystem now, I hope we're not there, is that some of these big dogs are gonna have to fail with younger, more progressive firms who are willing to take on risk at different levels by investing 30, 20, $40 million of capital with organizations that are led by African Americans, because they see that's where the growth is. They see that's where the market share is going to be. And so how do they get in there early? And so I use the football analogy not to, persuade minds, but it's the reality that some people have to lose who are used to winning. I mean, Bear Bryant was a great coach, but he didn't become his Hall of Fame self until he started bringing on African-American players to the South. And so I think there's a reality that we have to understand, that some people won't learn by us talking to them. They're going to learn by the results of others who are willing to take that chance.
Right, I agree. I would also ask how do we hold large institutions such as government, municipal governments, hospitals, unions, also who are large depositors in these institutions, also accountable, for where they're placing their dollars as another leverage point, particularly when we are large populations within these, these institutions, or these institutions
Did we lose you? Did we lose his audio? Does anybody else?
Yeah,
I'm not coming through.
We lost your audio, Wyking.
Oh, is it back?
You're back now, yes.
Okay, I was just saying, I also see opportunities to hold large institutions such as, municipal governments and others accountable for where they're depositing their dollars, which are often our dollars too, right? School districts, any institution that is espousing, principles of equity, race, social justice, et cetera, et cetera. How do we raise that conversation? Oh, well, yes, that's good. You're saying these things in this aspect of your organization. Where are you holding your funds, and how is that institution, also aligned with these values that you say that you have, right? I think that's also another opportunity to leverage our collective power after we're leveraging our own dollars. These other institutions that we're a part of also can be a part of that process.
Nneka, I want to ask you, your perspective coming from the corporate world. You mentioned the changes that need to happen at that higher level. I'm curious, when you've got people in these underserved Black communities, what are some creative ways for them to get to that money or overcome those barriers to get the money that they need to see within their communities to grow a business, invest in their community, et cetera?
So I just want to rephrase. Are you saying how can the average person can
The
access
average
capital?
person. Yes.
So I feel like there's a number of ways. First, there's CDFI, so community financial development institutions. I think there are EDCs, or economic development corporations, on the grassroots level, on a very small level, where people can access micro lending and business consultation to get their businesses started, right? Whether it's a side hustle or the foundations for something major. And then we have organizations like META that has access to SBA funding. We also have organizations like the African Development Center that will have a loan officer kind of work with you so that you can get to the point where you can be approved for an SBA loan. What I'm saying is we need to see that at a higher level. I don't want to see that at the $5,000 and the $10,000 level. It's important and it has its place. But when we look at the SBA in aggregate, when we look at the number of African Americans who are denied SBA loans, I think it's 45% or something like that. African Americans make up a very small portion of SBA loans above 50,000. So when we look at that level of entrepreneur, that's an entrepreneur that has already been in business for a particular period of time. That's an entrepreneur that has had some success. We have rates at historic lows, and we have African Americans that are not only unable to access the capital, and it's not just credit and different things of that nature. It's if you don't get approved for an SBA loan, your venture capital requirements for any other area of business are dire. You basically will not meet investors' eligibility requirements to be able to raise capital to do the type of development that needs to happen. So when we look at executives at these top banks, when we look to these top banks, we have to hold them accountable. And part of the way we hold them accountable is by asking for someone who looks like you to come to the table. So we want to hold these banks accountable, but then when we come to the table, we don't want to ask for a Black American person. We don't want to ask how diverse their teams are. You don't always have to do business with a Black business necessarily, right? I mean, sometimes you can do business with some of these very large corporations, but make sure that you have representation and a seat at the table, right? And when you have that seat at the table, we can't then be afraid to advocate. And part of the reasons we're afraid to advocate is because all of these different corporations have these different policies about what we can say publicly, right? I'm not a spokesperson for the company that I receive my W-2 income in this conversation. I'm a spokesperson for myself as a business and as a business owner. But what happens is we become spokespersons by default. And in the area of social media and an area of a viral whatever, we become afraid to advocate. And that we must stop. Every panelist who's listening, we must stop. We must be unafraid to have procurement conversations with every organization that we engage in. And one of the things that I'm not saying that we should promote and support and patron Black businesses to the exclusion of others or pick someone. I'm saying that when you're looking, you need to make sure that there is somebody that looks like you who's equally as qualified to come to the table. So if we're having a conversation about development, all of this development needs to take place now. We need to make sure that there's a developer at the table who can compete that looks like you, that is qualified. And so that's the conversation that all of us can have. That's an impact all of us can have. We can all reach out to these organizations to figure out how to sharpen our blade, right? Sharpen our sword, get it together as it relates to making ourselves attractive to lenders and to capital. We shouldn't have to just go to crowdfunding. That's not what our peers have to do. So what we must do is get to the point where we can raise the type of capital that our counterparts are raising without having to go to GoFundMe. And that is a reasonable request. Lending creates opportunity, right? Especially when you're pretty much borrowing at zero, right? When you look at a $350,000 30-year business loan at 1%, that is opportunity. And what we can't do is sacrifice that type of opportunity to accept crumbs, to accept something else that does not have the same exponential wealth creation, generational wealth component.
So I'll open the floor to the others. Do you all have examples of good partnerships that you've seen in the community development that you've been a part of?
Yeah, I think there's something that she said that I want to make sure is highlighted, and then I'll kind of dive into the community partnership. Is that, you know, in the circles, even around procurement, capital placement, all these things, there's this myth around experience, right? And we confuse in those conversations experience with expertise. And the reason why I think there's a nuanced difference is that the status quo has tons of experience at doing things bad, tons of experiences at failing, tons of experiences at doing C-level work. And yet you have this ripe, burgeoning class, group, ethnic, race of people who are expertise-wise doing A-level work with crumbs. And what happens when you invest in them in a way that they can do A-level work with the resources that are transformative? And so when we look at procurement in the state of Minnesota, and they did the disparity study between 9 of our largest kind of procurement institutions, the state, county, cities. I mean, there was $7 billion of procurement throughout the course of this study. Less than 1% went to Black businesses. And we're talking about monumental, game-changing dollars amounts that our public institutions are spending, that if we just did the right thing, not through incremental, like 1, then 2, then 4, then 8, but we're talking like if we can just correct our already poorly done execution. I mean, there's a lot of conversations, especially in the capital world, around execution risk, but yet we have a status quo that is failing to execute on the things that we have already set up. And so goals are not enough. Execution in implementation is really the power that we need to be driving into this next era. And so I would say partnership level, we are seeing, at least from my perspective, a lot of national examples popping up. We saw Microsoft invest $25 million in Shank's private equity group out on the West Coast. We saw recently Keisha Cash just raised $55 million as a general partner to invest in diverse businesses, where over 80% of our capital allocation has been with Black entrepreneurs that are in high impact, high growth, doing A caliber work. We see Starlight Capital in Cincinnati raising $27 million and placing it in diverse businesses. And so what we're starting to see is a national framework that's recognizing Harlem Capital out of New York. But what we aren't seeing in some of these more forward-leaning progressive places, Midwest and on the West Coast, we haven't seen that same level of modeling, to the point that we've always been hitting on of, we need scalable capital sources that at our discretion, because we have that expertise.
Agreed. You know, I think the scale of partnerships that are needed, I can't speak to really seeing those. We have been involved in some projects, partnering with more established, more well-resourced affordable housing developers to facilitate our projects, you know, because again, we run into balance sheet issue, you know, as we're growing the organization. And one thing I can say is that it's important that those partnerships are equitable, right? Because oftentimes our community-based organizations can be leveraged into positions where they're really just the veneer in the face of a deal, but it's not significant capital coming into the organization, and there's not significant agency over, you know, the decisions that are being made within the development, and there isn't significant enough capacity that the organization can grow beyond needing to be or being kind of forced into those relationships based on the funding sources. So again, I think that when we're talking about things like low-income housing tax credits, which is where, you know, financing for the type of projects that we're doing are coming from, you know, those investors are, you know, are also having a say in the deal structures, right? And so I think there's upline conversations about how do we facilitate, you know, more equity back into our communities at the ground level, right? And so those are some things that we're seeing. I think there's also opportunities for municipalities, again, other, you know, institutions to play a role when it comes to, you know, the guarantees for deals, which is, you know, again, what comes back to the, you know, the deal structure, and looking at just alternative financing methods. I mean, some of the things that we're policy level things that we're addressing here is around municipal bank or state bank, right? To take out some of the the barriers that we face in the private sector as well. So.
You gave a perfect segue, because that was really where my mind was going next was, okay, we know we need money, we need capital in a big way. But then we've also alluded to the history of this country, you know, the redlining, slavery. I mean, all of these things that have worked against Black people. I'll open the floor to any of you if you have opinions on the sort of policy and governmental change that you would like to see to help enable the growth that we would like to see in the Black community.
Still working against Black people, right? Because that's the thing about compounding interest. It's either working for you or it's working against you, right? And so for us, not having access to our capital, our equity, is working against us, and it's benefiting still those same institutions, you know, that benefited from the initial maldistribution of capital due to slavery and the policies that, you know, followed. So I would, you know, for us, reparations is always on the table. As we have to have bold, you know, unprecedented shifts in capital. Like, it's not going to happen just from, you know, us, you know, hoping and talking and wishing it. Like there has to be shifts in where the capital is from one balance sheet to another balance sheet, right? And so for us, we think that, you know, reparations and whatever different, you know, structures to, you know, maximize, you know, the impact of the capital needs to happen. But that's kind of the conversation, you know. And you know, here in Seattle, kind of one form of, I guess, you know, reparations light is an initiative that was the Equitable Development Initiative with the city of Seattle, where a pool of dollars was created to specifically support development, dollars into developments, particularly affordable housing developments that often the housing dollars can't be used to support, say, the commercial space dollars, right? To bring down the cost of the commercial space and make it affordable to commercial tenants in our community that, again, are undercapitalized already. So this fund was created through the advocacy of multiple communities or neighborhoods that were facing the same challenge. The pool was created, which prioritizes investments in anti-displacement projects, you know, in various neighborhoods in the city. I think it's a tool that can be improved upon and can be scaled from, again, you know, government. So that's I think that's an example of a particular policy that can be used, and you know, also designating specific tax sources also.
I personally would like to see the spend of the state um, in alignment with the population, right? So if we look at the economic spend, if we look at development dollars from a policy standpoint, I would like to personally see legislation that says, you know, if your population is XYZ% Black, the spend should be consistent with that. So I would like to see that on a macro level. On a micro level, I'd like to see that in other areas. So if we look at Parks and Rec, when you have an event at an organization that's owned by Parks and Rec, you have to go with a particular catering company. You have to go with a particular, we need to be able to push back on all of that and say that that needs to be as diverse as the city of Minneapolis. If we're talking about Parks and Rec in the city of Minneapolis, as diverse as the city of St. Paul, if we're talking about Parks and Rec in the city of St. Paul. And the reason this matters is because we look at little pockets of wealth creation that occurs, you know, as a result of, you know, these contracts. And then we have this ancillary conversation over here as if it's separate. And what I'm saying is it's absolutely not separate. If you have a business and no one will do business with you and you're systemically pushed out of the room, then that's a problem. And each one of us today can become an advocate to push back against against that narrative and that reality for so many, right? So I want contracts to be consistent with the population. When we're at these big corporations, right? It's the exact same, right? You have organizations that are extremely diverse, ethnically diverse. But then when we look at the economic spend, we're not pushing back on that economic spend. And we cannot move the comma to the left without addressing the conversation regarding economic spend. And so from a policy standpoint, I would like to see that on a national level. I would like to see it on a local level. And then I would like to see it in community, evidenced in some of the nonprofits and organizations that we involve ourselves in, major corporations as well. Everybody having the conversation. You're not trying to go extreme. You're just trying to say, I want it to be consistent with the population. And that's the policy change that I'd like to see across the board.
Absolutely. And I would just, add that, where there's been systemic exclusion, it justifies systemic inclusion also, So again, you have to, that's the only way you can get to any type of equity and balance, is if, specific initiatives are implemented to address and repair where harm and damages have been done previously. And I think we're in a time now, you have books like Color of Law, Color of Money that, and all the government, a lot of studies are showing the clear evidence of the systemic exclusion, the damage and the harm done, but we're slow to move to systemic inclusion.
I love that phrase.
Yeah, so by far, our government is a huge lender or secondary mortgage market for housing. And to the point made earlier, the most denied loan amount is under $70,000 when it comes to housing, because it's folks looking to buy back into neighborhoods that have been disinvested in, or in rural communities. I seen there was a question asking about how do these economic development lenses work in rural communities. And I think the rural community is one where we've seen extreme wealth extraction from African-American hands throughout history, particularly when the Homestead Act was allowed prior to, emancipation, but then also post Civil War, when we had, 80 million acres of land held in African-American hands. The USDA, along with some of its local banking institutions and sharecropping partners on the private side, systematically stripped away African-American ownership of land in the agricultural world. I mean, the Atlantic did a huge write-up on how the history of land taken away through a triangle of I would say, private, public intervention in the market. So I wholeheartedly agree that procurement is probably the easiest thing government can do to affect change, and not just based on, I would say not based on current population. I would say there should be a 10-year lookout, because you need to invest in families that are large and growing now. Otherwise, those children never see the benefit, and some of them fall through the cracks, and it's too late when it's their turn to be an adult and run a small business. And so there needs to be some sort of lookout on projection and growth to match procurement. But I would say government lending is probably the place second to procurement, where you have the most direct impact on existing systems, existing things that are in place, that you can affect change at the SBA and the USDA level, so that folks who are entrepreneurs who are burgeoning can get access to that capital. And I think there needs to be requirements, not goals, in order for that change to be effective. And lastly, Wyking mentioned it, there has to be a reconciliation for the balance sheet discrepancies that have been caused and legislated into our municipal, state, and federal government systems. And the federal government is the only one with the balance sheet to make those repairments in our society. And so there has to be a long-term federal initiative to reconcile the overall historic discrepancies of balance sheet legislation in our community.
Thank you for that. Yeah, you all made some great points. I agree with everything you said. I loved what you said, Wyking, about you know, those years of exclusion now warrants years of inclusion, you know, and purposeful inclusion. And Nneka, you're right. I mean, we can't 400 years of disenfranchisement can't be fixed with small, you know, $5,000 and $10,000 loans. We need some meaningful investments into the community. I'm sure you all have seen, we had some Q&A come in from the audience. DeAngelis, you already alluded to this first one a little bit, but I'm gonna read this out loud to give the others an opportunity to respond. How can rural community economic development be more inclusive of Black entrepreneurship, especially when the community is predominantly white with a growing Black population? What community visions, connections, approaches, or policy standards would you be looking for to show support in that area that needs Black business? So we've spoken so much about being in the city, and just curious if anyone has a different perspective or a different approach in a rural area, and especially a white rural area. How can Black businesses thrive there?
I'm gonna answer real quick and get out the way. I would say the need in the urban core and the need in rural America, if you strip away kind of the cultural differences between the two, they have the same needs of capital, same needs for healthy food, and same needs for environmental regulation to protect their health and wellness. And so I think there's a lot that can be same agenda minded between urban, especially African Americans, and rural whites. There's a lot in common that we have with each other, especially when we talk about more between African Americans, especially in certain cities, have more conservative values than even some of the rural counterparts that are white. So I think race can blur the lines of like the needs from those groups of people are the same. And I would say that rural South and rural North are where the demographics shift between predominantly Black rural areas and predominantly white. But I would say those needs transcend race in a lot of places, except for the corrective needs that are historical.
From my perspective, I think there's a couple levels to that question. One, I would like to, you know, kind of go back to Nneka's earlier point about seeing spend, you know, on par with population. But in general, when we talk about business, we're talking about, you know, solving a problem, meeting a need, right? And so, you know, if, you know, that doesn't have to be limited to your population. And so seeing businesses, you know, serve the needs of population regardless of ethnicity would be great, but then you have to take into account the sentiment of, you know, the population, depending on what the, you know, the rural demographics are. You know, will the, you know, population have attitudes that allow them to spend money with a, you know, quality product or service, right? That's another part of the question. But then you also do have the public, you know, and the governments and how they're spending money in those areas too. And so again, looking at, you know, purposeful, as you said, I like that, purposeful, you know, systemic inclusion, and again, making sure that it's on par, at minimum on par with the population demographics are some of the opportunities.
Okay, and then I will jump into this next one, which I find very interesting because we haven't touched on this too much just yet, the topic of gentrification. So the question comes from Wale, and he says, are there concerns that pressure and demands from funding sources and partnerships outside of the Black community could foster gentrification? How can you develop and grow wealth in Black communities without sowing the seeds of gentrification?
So I would say that gentrification is another convoluted and mysterious, nebulous thing that we talk about that has a ton of market factors. So there's some market realities that have to be dealt with. And I think we discussed how to solve some of those, right? But I think Wyking mentioned earlier that this is about people and not place. People development. And when you do people development, their incomes and cost of living rise in proportion, so that they aren't displaced, that they aren't gentrified, and that people in those communities can have nice things too and not be forced out. And so if you look at this as focusing on people and not physical place, or binding ourselves to physical place only, I think there's some inherent remedies to focusing on the people in those communities, not just the buildings they live in.
I don't think you can do this without policy, without a policy response, which is why I think it was so powerful that he spoke, Wyking, about systemic inclusion. Because when you look at gentrification, right, that's happening, it's investment in these communities, then you have to have a policy response to be able to say, we can, and this is already done. So this isn't something that, isn't already happening. Right now, you can already get grants from lending institutions if you're in particular zip codes, right? If you buy a house in a particular zip code in a particular area, if you meet a certain income requirement. And so what we would like to see, or what I would like to see, is more land trust organizations that have a focus on providing space to people who are indigenous to the area that they're developing. So would we be able to say, if these development dollars come in, is there some type of credit that can be given for a particular type of family demographic that is reflective of the neighborhood that you want to see, that doesn't exclude the people that live there? So if you look at the Rondo community, is there some type of policy response that is needed? And that's the answer. We can't do it with a nonprofit response. We have to do it with an effort from state, local legislature, in addition to everything else that we discussed. So I don't think we get there without policy.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, because policy facilitated, right? People speak about gentrification a lot of times as if it's just some natural phenomenon, that just is a force of nature and it just happens. But really, it's facilitated by policy choices, right? Just like, homesteading, just like, Black people, women not being able to, own property. These are policy decisions, either in the public or the private sector. So you do have to balance it out with that. I can speak to some specific things that we're focused on here with Africatown Community Land Trust. And there's a couple things. One, addressing the systematic exclusion from participation in the knowledge-based growth, innovation economy that's grown around us, particularly in, Seattle being one of those tech hubs, right? And so that, not being a part of that, now our community is being impacted by that, as the housing value, the cost of housing is driven up by those high wage workers, where we're underrepresented on both the employment side and the entrepreneur side. But going back to the policy, when we think about the fact, or, again, lift up that, redlining federal, housing policy, right? Urban renewal or urban removal, or some have called it, Negro removal. The Federal Highway Act, basically weaponizing highways and being driven through many, viable Black commercial districts, and eminent domain, taking people's property. These are all policy decisions that have happened, right? And so some of the things that we're focused on here, and then we can go all the way through, predatory lending, et cetera, et cetera. But looking at through our housing and what has been adopted now at the city level is a community preference policy, which prioritizes those that have been negatively impacted by such policies and displaced from the communities, and giving them basically a right to return to the community. Portland has a policy that is surrounding home ownership. I'm not exactly sure on the data right now, but I know that was the intention for new home ownership projects there to prioritize people who have been displaced from a particular neighborhood. We know that around the rental properties that we've done, we were able to, in context of fair housing laws and affirmative marketing and further fair housing, reach nearly 90% occupancy from people who had historic roots in the community or have been displaced or at risk of displacement in our first project, the Liberty Bank building. Since that time, the actual policy has been signed into legislation by the city of Seattle in the mayor. So those are a couple, policy level things that have been introduced that we want to scale up. Again, systemic exclusion, warrants systemic inclusion if we're going to get to any type of equity. And so those are a couple of the tools that we're using. We're also applying that to a new land trust affordable home ownership project that we're a part of and working to develop as well. So yes, I mean, we have to look at, gentrification as not just, the market doesn't just operate independently, right? It works within regulatory environments, policy environments, and things of that nature, so who is being incentivized to do what? Land use changes have negative impacts we're seeing in our community on legacy homeowners. Predatory development is escalated when the land is upzoned, right? So there has to be a policy, protection to facilitate, those homeowners, which are many of are now seniors retired on fixed incomes, and the property taxes keep going up, and they're not able to access capital to develop the property themselves. So they're only given the option to sell and and so these are some areas where, again, policy is driving, gentrification, which is amounting to ethnic cleansing in many of our, in Seattle, and I think many other neighborhoods on an economic level.
I'm so glad that you even spoke about the link, right? Because you talked about it on the macro level, but then you tied it to the grandmother that now can't afford their property taxes. And so there can be a legislative response to that. And people listen to these conversations, but they don't understand that there are tax credits. They don't understand with certain developments and certain opportunity zones that the builder or that the development was incentivized by policy to cause them to come to that neighborhood. And the reason that there may be a little strip of affordable housing or a little bit of commercial development as a part of the apartment building that they put together was policy and tax credits. And so we have to be asking for those same things when it comes to that grandmother that can't afford those property taxes, that is a part of that community that was once displaced from the community. Certainly that there can be a policy response to be able to take care of those folks. And we have to ask for it. We have to demand it from our city and local legislatures. Some of these things, a lot of times when we think we're talking about policy, we're not talking about people in Washington. We're talking about people in the state where you're at making decisions. And so I just love the conversation that's being had and what you're able to add to the conversation.
DeAngelis, I will give you a brief moment if you felt like you had something you wanted to add to the gentrification conversation. We're down to our final 5 minutes here, so we'll get to closing remarks as well.
No, they cover enough of it. If you focus on the people, you can find a solution.
All right, well, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to open the floor to you one last time. If you have any final takeaways that you want our guests to remember as they leave this room today, what would be that one final takeaway?
I would say focus on the numbers, right? Like, let's not get lost in the conversation. I know one thing in Seattle that often happens is people think talking about the problem is solving the problem, right? And that's not solving the problem. The only way we know if we're solving the problem is if we see the numbers changing in reality, right? So being clear and, keeping a scorecard and looking and being accountable all levels, in terms of what do the numbers tell us about where we are. For us in Seattle, when we look at the numbers say that we are dealing with de facto Jim Crow apartheid in 2020, right? And this is what the numbers say, right? But the marketing and the public relations says, liberal, progressive, inclusive, shared prosperity, right? So we have to, have a common ground. And, there's a saying, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. We know statistics can, but at least that's a good starting place for us, is to have those numbers and actually hold people accountable for how do we get from current situation to future desired situation, and how do the numbers change around the way? What are the specific interventions? So, for example, here in our work, we're saying, okay, well, there's projections that 100,000 new people are coming to Seattle, each year. Who are those people? Where do they live? What percentage of those people, where do they work, right? What percentage of those people are Black, right? What happens to the Black population that is here now? What are the trajectories, right? And how do you get us from, a declining population to a stable or a population that's growing at the rate of the rest of the city, right? That would be the minimum level of equity. And actually seeing plans and strategies to get us there, and then understand what are the milestones and what does the year over year look like in relation to those projections and strategies to accomplish the particular goal. So I think if we bring it down to specific, actionable, and have our metrics, that can keep us grounded. And if we're off track or we're not making the progress that needs to be made, adjustments can be made, right? And to get on track. But there is some degree of accountability. And I think that that's where, we should start conversations with the numbers that tell us what's the reality of the situation, and then understand what the numbers that we're striving to go to and how we're going to get there.
Nneka, I want you to have the last word and mic drop because of the heat you've been bringing. And so I'm going to say that, just very simply, where there's no love, there's no leadership. There's no reason. The reason why mothers and fathers are willing to protect and defend their families in harm's way is because they love their family, and they're willing to be brave for them. If there's no love, if there's no relationship between the status quo and those that they're looking to impact, there will be no bravery to do something different, and there will be no leadership to innovate.
Oh my goodness, all these amazing words. I will just say that it starts with you, with all that has been said. A lot of times when we hear information like this, we feel like it's so above us. And I just want everybody to know that nothing is above us. We in our individual seat can move the needle and transform. We can move the comma to the left for ourselves, and we can also do it for our neighbor. We can also stimulate growth in the Black community by doing everything that you heard, but just by taking a stand and asking certain questions, asking for certain metrics, being bold, being brave, unafraid, and unwavering in our approach and our stance. And that's it. And I love what everybody has said: when there's no leadership, when there's no love, there's no leadership. My goodness, that's a wonderful phrase. Moving from systematic exclusion to systemic inclusion. All of those things are wonderful nuggets that we can all take away. But just when you leave this conversation, just understand that it starts with us. And there's change that each one of us can make in communities financially by asking certain questions. And let's just do that.
All right, very well said. Thank you to all three of you, D'Angelo's, Wyking, Nneka. It's been great conversation. Thank you for all of our guests for being here today. As we're wrapping this up, we invite you to go over to our digital main stage for the keynote presentation today. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you for being able to, put together a great panel. This was, like you said, it was bringing the heat. So yeah, thank you. I look forward to learning more.
Can you put the room for the digital main stage just for anybody who may have missed it? Can you just put it in the chat?
Also, I'll just add my email in the chat if anybody wants to reach
I'll
out.
do the same.
It will be through Crowd Compass. I can send you a link in email because each person has an individual registration. So I can get that to you, Nneka. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.